I'm chair of the all-party group on vaccinations for all at Westminster, the People's Vaccine. I'm a supporter. Our APPG is a member of that, and I've been campaigning around vaccine equity for low and middle income countries since, frankly, we had a vaccine. And it's ridiculous that more than 18 months on, we have completely failed. In spring 2020, we had really warm words about a global response to a global crisis. Unfortunately, we didn't live up to that at all. It has been wealthy countries who've hoovered up the PPE, have hoovered up the diagnostic tests, and then hoovered up the vaccines. So what we ended up with was, survival of the fittest, devil take the hindmost. Absolutely not something that any of us should be supporting or tolerating. And that's what we need to change. When you look, as you talked about the first lockdown, when our lives literally just had a grenade thrown into them. I mean, I remember waking up in the morning and thinking, am I in a science fiction film? We just couldn't imagine how much our lives could change in just a matter of days. And yet there were many things that we learned how to do, including this. We're all experts on Zoom. And I tell you, I couldn't have even found a Zoom app before the pandemic. So we can change when we have to, but we shouldn't wait for disaster to change us. And I think that's why there is a real appetite at this moment in time for us to take radical action and to change. Now, many of you will know that I was a breast cancer surgeon and doctor for almost 3.5 decades. So I was often looking after patients, whether from trauma or in general surgery or cancer or breast cancer, one at a time. But gradually, as you become older as a doctor, you realize you're kind of bailing out a boat that's got a hole in it, because it's not the NHS that gives you health. The NHS is more about helping you cope with illness, catching you if you fall. Now, the problem is, it would be more logical to kind of call it a national illness service, but I can't imagine anyone wanting to work in that. But what gives us health and well-being, which is where our focus should go, is quite different. And it's a holistic approach to the well-being of every single person in Scotland, in the UK, and all our brothers and sisters across the world. And if we start to think of that in that holistic way, it also changes our relationship with other people. And it becomes our duty to not just think about ourselves, but to think about the physical, mental, social, economic, and environmental well-being of every single person around us. Because it is the people around us. We contribute, but we also take away. We support, but we also undermine. And most of the policies that actually generate health and well-being are nothing to do with the health service, bar probably vaccination, which does actually protect people throughout their lives. It's generated for children by having a decent start in life, their mother having enough food, them living in a warm home, having enough to eat, having a decent education, social inclusion, not being isolated or lonely. We know now the damage of that, but also having personal agency, having the ability to make decisions for yourself. And we saw how the pandemic undermined that for many people, because people were isolated and lonely. People were suffering from the physical illnesses of COVID, or physical illnesses that were neglected because of the pressure on the NHS. If they couldn't work, they had financial worries, mental stress, and some sadly have been left with chronic ill health because of COVID. And even the backlog that our health service faces means we can't just easily get treatment for things we took for granted. But on the other side, what I would say is people have reevaluated their priorities. I used to love seeing, when I would be out for some exercise, men out on their bikes with all their family, who probably at that time of day would have been on a train or in a traffic jam commuting because they were working from home. And so people are reevaluating. They want a better work-life balance. They prioritize interaction with loved ones over expensive entertainment. They're appreciating if they're lucky enough to live somewhere with access to natural spaces. But all of us here know, because we had COP26 last year, we've been talking about the climate crisis for a long time, that we need a different economic and social model by the end of this decade, or we're simply just going to eat the planet. And this is a moment where people want that change. So as we come back out of COVID, people don't want to go back to business as usual, with richer people getting richer and richer, poor people being made poorer and poorer. And the problem is we're in real danger of that now with this cost of living crisis, which is emerging. And we still often see the same approach, that if you have money, you can generate money. If you don't have money, you may just get left behind. So the aim of a well-being economy is for an economy that is fairer, that actually values the worth of everybody, but is also more sustainable for the planet. And it's not either or, we go for green and sustainable, or we go for a decent economy. In actual fact, they can both be happening at the same time. And it's quite crucial that they do happen at the same time if we are going to be in that better place in the next 10 years. What many people don't know is that Scotland was the founder of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Group in 2018 with Iceland and New Zealand, and other countries have joined since. It comes up with a framework, it comes up with themes and threads, and it's to try to get public bodies and every level of government, when they make decisions, to put people at the heart of that. So if you imagine in a local council, when they're sitting around talking about a town centre, what dominates in a town centre? Well, I can tell you, it's a car. Where the car can drive, where the car can park, how easily people can get in and out of their cars. Why do we not put people where they walk, where they might cycle, where they might scoot, where they could stand and chat without forcing other people off a pavement into the road, where they could maybe sit down and chat and have some planting and some trees? We've ended up for the last half century that it's inanimate objects like cars that dominate the space that we live in, pollute the space we live in, run people over, and make our village centres, town centres, not places for us. So all of the things that would generate the well-being, so inclusion, easy to meet people if you're popping down the shops, the good housing, enough food to eat. Those are not health service things. They're not things the NHS can fix. They're things that have to actually be fixed fundamentally in the way we organise our economy and how we organise our society. Because poverty is the biggest single driver of ill health. And what we've seen is poverty among children, among elderly, and among disabled has actually been on the rise now for the last 10 years. And the problem with that is, it's not something that saves you money. Austerity doesn't save you money. It might look good on a national balance sheet, but what it does is it takes money out of a local economy. It takes money away from local businesses who would employ people, but also you end up picking up the pieces later. So if you think about children, if a woman isn't well enough nourished when she's pregnant, then that child is not getting a decent start in life. If a woman is carrying a female child, all the eggs of that baby are formed during the time in the womb. So actually a woman is carrying her potential grandchildren. So any harm to a pregnant woman is already affecting 2 generations. And we now know that so much of ill health in later life is affected in these very early months of pregnancy, babyhood, and childhood. And I remember when I was doing an inquiry into what we might expect the impacts of rising child poverty to be, an academic from Liverpool University, a public health scientist, saying that we lose in the UK 1,400 children a year before their 15th birthday as a direct result of poverty. That's from premature birth, low birth weight, fetal alcohol syndrome, house fires, car accidents, addiction, suicide. That's a shocking figure. If there was a large secondary school with the roof collapsing every year, or there was a toxin that was killing every child in one big secondary school every year, surely we would do something about it. So why do we not do something about it? Why have we allowed that our economy and our society is always disadvantaging the most vulnerable, the youngest, the oldest? As Christians, we are people who should want to look after everyone around us. And to me, a well-being economy is something that is looking to be fairer among people, but also fairer to the planet, fairer to the people who are not born yet. So what we often heard since the 80s was this principle of trickle-down economics. If you put lots of money in tax cuts at the top, somehow it'll percolate down to ordinary people. And we know that doesn't happen. In actual fact, so even people who are hard-nosed, looking only at the money, that doesn't work. Injecting the money at the bottom, where people spend what they earn or what their income is, and they spend it in their local economy, is what actually makes an economy active. It'll all end up in the hands of the banks, the government, or the wealthy, but it will have spiraled up that pyramid, having an impact on the way up. So someone has got money to spend in the butchers or the bakers. The butcher can afford to take his wife out for a meal. She's buying a new jumper in the shop in the town. All of that gives us a vibrant local economy. Whereas what we are often facing is dead high streets, unemployment locally, and depressed economies. And it's important that we actually change that shape, because the other aspect of it is that we have turned into purely consumers. And that was a change in the 80s. We've lost any sense of satisfaction, any sense of having enough. You see people queuing around the block to get a new iPhone, whatever, in the middle of the night, even though their last version works absolutely fine. And so if we're going to improve for people, we need the economy to work to make their lives richer, more fulfilling, and healthier. But we in return then need to actually look after each other, look after our local economies, and look after our planet, both in our local space and the whole planet that we live on. Because we've only got one. If we destroy this planet, you know, there isn't a backup. As they say, there's no planet B. So what we need to see is that change to something that is fairer, but also more sustainable, to support vulnerable citizens to live in dignity and to be independent, to be active, to be decision makers, and to be parts of our community, not to be tidied away where we don't see them and where they can't bother us. But it also calls on us to take actions as individuals. And that is to recover that sense of satisfaction of, I have enough. I don't need to go on earning and earning money at the expense of never seeing my children. I don't need to buy a bigger and faster car, newer iPhones, or throw away fashion, because all of those things have literally turned us into people who are consuming our planet and are consuming resources that frankly don't belong to us. Many of them belong to people in other parts of the world, but they also belong to those who aren't born yet. So while more of us are conscious of our CO2 footprint, of trying to deal with waste, we recycle, we use energy efficient light bulbs, but we don't always think about stuff, the sheer amount of stuff that we buy, that we hoard, that is bulging out of our cupboards. And all of those things are contributing to our pressure on the planet. We don't bother to look into how they're made. Is there child labor? Is there modern slavery involved, either in making something or in recycling it? We're often shipping our recycled waste to countries where it is little children who are sifting through parts of computers with poisonous heavy metals in them. Do we pay enough attention to that? Do we pay a proper price for the goods that we actually buy that takes account of paying people well and of not destroying the planet? The thing, if I'm asked to speak to employers, that I remind them, and I would remind anybody on here who does run a business, is your staff are also your customers. So if you don't pay your staff enough to use your services, you're actually undermining your own business. And even if you're someone who, I'm here in Ayrshire, Prestwick is in my constituency, if you make plane engines, yeah, that's fine. Maybe your staff are not buying a plane engine to take home for the weekend. But if they can't ever afford to go on a holiday, then it's quite simple that you are diminishing your own business. So we need to be thinking about how we make what we make, how we remake it so that it becomes circular, and how we actually allow more people to have access to that economy so that they can live comfortably. Because poverty doesn't just drive ill physical health, it drives mental ill health. People worrying, and we're going to see that with this cost of living crisis that is already emerging, that people are thinking, how can I keep the lights on? How can I even think of keeping the heating on next year when we get into winter? How can I put enough food on the table? It causes strife between parents. Why did you spend that money? So we are going to be seeing more people in that precariousness. And that is why we can't just allow that as we come out of a pandemic that was life-threatening, societally threatening, and threatening to families, individuals, communities, we can't just allow that to follow a natural course without us calling for something different. We saw what communities could really do in the first lockdown. We saw people going and speaking to elderly people through windows, doing their shopping, coming and having a chat, painting rainbows on their windows. We found other ways of being in touch with each other, whether it was Zoom or standing in the garden talking over the hedge. And that's what we are all called to do. We're all called to be advocates for everyone in our society and also for our planet. And it isn't a choice. So things like a decent, well-insulated house improves fuel efficiency, but it also decreases fuel poverty. Having more sustainable farming or fishing here in Scotland improves food security, but also can lead to our children having access to better meals in schools, which will help them grow and develop. Now, if we take a well-being approach to international development, when we're dealing, as SCIAF does, in supporting low and middle income countries and communities there, we actually can realize that we have as much to learn from them. When I became a SCIAF ambassador, we were sent off to Kenya and Tanzania to visit HIV and AIDS projects. And we were told, you're not to come back with pictures of children like the old Biafra pictures of children with flies crawling over their eyes. We want positive stories. And I have to admit that sitting on the plane heading out to Nairobi, I thought, how on earth are we going to come back with positive stories for people who are living in one of the largest slums in the world in Nairobi, who are suffering either from HIV or AIDS and living in poverty? And I tell you, I could have come back in 24 hours because the energy, the creativity, the thankfulness of people that you met there was so humbling. You were almost embarrassed to talk about anything. So to me, if we look at how other communities live in different parts of the world, where they still have that inclusion of everyone, that community bonding, there's nobody who's just sitting in a house and nobody ever speaks to them. They have stronger intergenerational family bonds than we have. So if we are supporting people in other parts of the world and a well-being approach where people have enough water, enough food, land that is not destroyed by drought or flood, then you also reduce the risk of conflict and war. So to me, well-being of ourselves, our family, our community, our country, and our planet is something that has to be at the center of how we come out of this pandemic. And I'm already afraid that there is a drift back to business as usual. And that if we just do nothing, what we end up with in the next couple of years is going to be quite random. And it is likely that many people will be left behind. And when we get to the end of this decade, where there is that last chance to avoid the worst of a climate crisis, we'll be looking back and say, why didn't we take that chance? Because our society and economy was roaring along like a speeding train. And it's hard to modify a train when it's moving. But the one thing that COVID did give us is it brought our society and our economy to a shuddering halt. We all remember that, literally from one week to the next. Everything we thought we knew and took for granted had stopped. So we actually have a moment of choice at the moment. What is it we want to rebuild? What are we going to expend our time, our energy, and our money in rebuilding after COVID? And I would suggest that we all want something different from what we had before COVID. And we have a responsibility as Christians to think about our brothers and sisters across the world, something that is much fairer than what we saw the behavior, whether it's vaccines or diagnostic tests or anything else. The fact that our more vulnerable partner countries in the global south were left with nothing while we hoovered up everything that was available. But also that we think about it's them that will pay the price if we don't tackle the climate crisis. So we know we need to change, and this is the moment we need to change in. So we all have that responsibility for everyone who is alive now, not just the people we know about or love or care about. We have a responsibility for everyone. But we also have a responsibility for those to come. Any of you who have grandchildren, you know how much you love and adore them. Well, when their time comes, they will also love and adore their grandchildren. So what are we leaving to them? How stressful will our grandchildren feel if when they look at their own grandchildren, they only imagine disaster and nothing positive left on this planet? So I would call on all of us to be advocates for radical change and to make sure that we are good ancestors to those who are going to follow after us. Thank you.